Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of the Benjamin Franklin House Virtual Talks. My name is Caitlin. I am the Operations Manager, and I am delighted today to introduce Dr. George Boudreau, speaking about his final chapter, Benjamin Franklin's Busy Final 5 Years. And now I'll turn over to George.
Thank you, Caitlin. I was going to sort of play a hoax on you, a la Franklin, and change my background. I tried to download a picture of the stairs of Franklin House, and I was going to have myself broadcasting as if there. Since the house opened and since I wasn't a poor student anymore and went over every year, I think I've given a lecture on average about every year at Franklin House, with one exception when I was too busy here to come over. And it is lovely to be back. I would like to say to all of you, welcome, and please take the tour of the house after we're done today. And Caitlin and Marcia and Eleanor, we're going to lead the group to the Ship and Shovel around the corner after this. It's one of my favorite London pubs, and then I don't know who of my London friends is on here, and then I'm sure we'll end up in Soho in a few hours, and we can't do that tonight because of COVID. But it's lovely to think of all of you on that side of the pond, and to think I'm told that a bunch of friends in America, because of the way this is set up, I can't see you. That keeps us from having any intruders. If you are seeing my full screen right now, you'll see another name, and I'm really delighted to get to welcome my beloved second father and undergraduate mentor who told me 37 years ago, David, that I should get a PhD in history. And we added him here so we could make sure he was linked in. And it's nice to have just a gathering. Some of you now are checking in. You can add questions and such. So I'd love to read those. With my lousy eyesight, I can't do this. But when Caitlin got in touch with me and said, well, I'd said months ago, I'll be over in May, thinking COVID would be over in 2 weeks. Like someone said, I can't remember who that was, that we would all be back together, and we're not. But I started thinking about this and thinking about previous projects, and really noodling on what I was working on lately and what I wanted to talk about. And I realized when I got the outline done for Caitlin and Eleanor that what I had outlined wasn't really so much a lecture, it was a book. It's a book I've been working on in recent years, and it's a book I've been working on while I was the 6-month postdoc at George Washington's Presidential Library at Mount Vernon, and before that at the Omohundro Institute. And it's a book that's been sort of gelling up, but let me talk to you a little bit about the subject and what we're going to do now. Let's see, I have to do this. And Caitlin, are you seeing my PowerPoint? I hope very much.
Not yet.
Not yet? We'll try this.
Yeah, if you press the share screen at the bottom, you should be able to find an option to select the PowerPoint if it's open.
Okay, done but undone. That's annoying. Now, any better? Sorry, folks. They did a wonderful job setting this up. Are you seeing it now?
No.
It seems to only allow me to share my screen if I am not looking at it, which is quite annoying. 1 second. That's very strange. 1 sec. Let's see if I do it this way. Any better?
No,
it's very annoying.
Still hasn't come up. Are you sure that's
Let's try that.
It's doing it now. Yep, we can see it now.
Thanks. Very good. How about that? Okay, sorry for that, everybody. We've all been saying a lot lately. We didn't know what Zoom was 2 months ago, and now we're all becoming master's candidates in it, but there we go. So I started working on this project many, many months back, and I think some of the teachers who participated in my National Endowment for the Humanities Philadelphia Summer Teachers Workshops are on here, and you've heard parts of this before. But I've been fascinated by Franklin's last years and fascinated by the fact that they're often overlooked. We look at the young man, pardon me, we look at the founder, we look at the writer, the printer, but he had an incredibly busy last few years of his life. And because some of the guideposts of that are missing, in his autobiography, the most famous document written by an 18th century Anglo-American, he never got to the American Revolution, much less the last years of his life. He took up writing several times during those years, but he never explained much about this. And so I became fascinated about this as a cultural moment, as a moment when America and the world that it was engaging in was going through, had undergone a profound transformation, and to try and get a better glimpse of how Benjamin Franklin fit into that. Of course, our story begins where several books about Franklin have left off. Well, we have no book that really deals with his final years. We have a lot of them that deal with his time at Paris. And of course, we know that he was considered a sage, considered a great man of the French court, considered an indispensable diplomat in his life in France from 1776 to 1785. He arrived there with no fanfare and really very little promise, but quickly used his fame as a natural philosopher, as a wise person, as a liberal democrat to engage in the court, not always to the thrill of King Louis XVI and some of his ministers. Marie Antoinette, as I've been oft quoted as saying, not one of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, found him charming and thought he brought good luck when she played cards. But Franklin really cemented himself into both the community of the court and at the diplomatic corps, and was so popular that friends literally begged him not to leave when he finally decided he needed to go back and see America one more time. And so my story begins with this departure from France, with a man now of such international fame that the Queen lent her mules and her litter to take him from Passy to the port. And one description that it was as if the entire town had lost its patriarch when this elderly gentleman got aboard his coach, his litter, and started making his way for the port. Thomas Jefferson was the younger diplomat. He was no teenager himself by this point. But Thomas Jefferson exclaimed that seeing Franklin surrounded by the ladies of the court made him jealous, and he wondered if when he succeeded Franklin as our minister plenipotentiary, he would also get the affection and the embraces of French women. And Franklin, now, of course, nearing 80, said to him, no, you're still too young for such things. Just wait until you're my age. And Jefferson, at James Madison's inauguration, would reflect on the fact that he was now an old man, getting a lot of offers of affection, but not taking anyone up on them. So Franklin started for home. On this, of course, he would make his last visit to the United Kingdom. And I have to admit, this week I've had a great deal of fun going back through my files about the stop at Southampton. I don't have any great images of the town during the 18th century, so I'll throw up the castle wall there, and you can all imagine along with me. This is a view I had when I got there on the Queen Mary teaching a course on Benjamin Franklin 5 years ago. But Franklin got to say goodbye, a lot of goodbyes, and was still, remarkably to me, incredibly popular among his old friends in England, having just beaten their king in the Revolutionary War. It was a time of reunions and rekindlings, and again, he was a person whose popularity went beyond the politics of the day. He obviously was not terribly popular with George III and his cronies. George Goodwin went into that a little more last week. And then but he also had very personal things to do there. Most famously, his only living son, William Franklin, had moved back to England from the Philadelphia region, where he had been royal governor of New Jersey, after New Jersey had declared its break from England. And this is a complicated story, and if I had a full hour, I could do it on these two men and their relationships and what this meeting was like. William was very much a man of the empire, as his father had been. Probably no American was more anglicized politically and culturally than Benjamin Franklin prior to the break with England in the 1770s. And then Franklin, of course, famously broke with the court. My old friend Sheila Skemp, who may be on this meeting today, has written a wonderful book about Franklin at the cockpit, going up against Alexander Lord Wedderburn, and his eventual break with England over the year that followed. William had stayed loyal to his oath, to his king, to his empire. He had been jailed as a result. Franklin, on his way back from England, had said, "Give it up and we'll move on with our lives without this empire." William had stayed a Tory, and of course was forced to leave the country. If you have the chance today, if you're one of our London viewers, and I think you're allowed to take walks again, you can go to St. Pancras Station and walk to the little churchyard just north of there where William's buried in an unmarked grave. I tried to find it, but they don't know where the grave is. William was to remain an Englishman for the remainder of his life. And that break would be played out in Franklin's last will, where he left William only the money he had borrowed and the books he had failed to return. It was quite a slap, but of course the revolution was a civil war in nature, and it was a civil war in the Franklin family as well. Again, I'd like to spend a great deal more time there, but I have to paint with a roller, not a fine brush today. Franklin set sail from Southampton after a few days layover there. And I detail in a rather detailed chapter the role of Franklin and the sea. He was born within the smell of the Atlantic Ocean on Milk Street in Boston. He had dreamed as a boy of going to sea. His father had put the kibosh on that because, of course, they had lost an older brother who had gone off to sea and never been heard from again. We could debate this, but he traveled the ocean as many times as any of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, a total of 4 round-trip journeys. And I pause that and I look at the documents that he wrote during this and think about what the ocean and what we've come based on the work of Bernard Bailyn and David Hancock and others to call the Atlantic world in the last few decades. Someone wrote me the other day and said, "What on earth does this mean?" And I teased him about being an Englishman, and he wanted to call it still the empire. But the sea and ocean voyages were incredibly important to Franklin. They gave him time for contemplation. They gave him time for scientific inquiry. He had, of course, I don't know if we can say he discovered the Gulf Stream, but by golly, he popularized it. And it gave him time for reflection as he was making this final journey home, back to a town, back up the Delaware River, to the same spot almost exactly where he'd entered as a runaway boy in 1723. The return home is a wonderful one, and I debated reading documents of it, but again, I have about 55 minutes, I'm guessing, or less, if there's going to be questions. But his return home was incredibly triumphant. In earlier research, which I'll go into in far more detail because I'll have more space in this book, I found a description by a young fellow named John Todd. Probably none of you have heard of John Todd. You could all raise your hands now. I seem to have hands being raised and such on this screen. But John Todd was a young member of the Society of Friends, a Quaker. He was studying in Philadelphia and eventually would marry a good Philadelphia Quaker girl named Dolly Payne. He's most famous as the man who died, and she had married a fellow from Virginia named James Madison. If you haven't heard of him, we could do another lecture on him sometime. But John Todd was writing a letter to his brother during his studies, and he was detailing fishing and hunting. It was kind of a typical boy's letter. And then you can see on the paper that he put the pen down, and a long while later he said, "Oh, the noise rang out, the bell started ringing. Dr. Franklin came back to Philadelphia." And the people of the city literally ran to the docks. And this is Philadelphia. Let's see. You see at the center of your screen, I wish I could be pointing at this in front of all of you in the Franklin Parlor in London. The center of the screen is the tallest building in Philadelphia for a century, which is Christ Church, Philadelphia. It's a very pretty little Georgian church, still there, still quite active. To just to its left, the sort of next highest spire, is the steeple or the clock tower, or they didn't have a clock in it at the time, of the State House, Independence Hall. So you can get a sense of how, in 1778, when engraving was done, how busy a port it was, how the city had grown and prospered. Of course, compared to London, it's still a village, but it's a busy little transatlantic port. And the people of the city literally ran towards the docks. And as the crew brought the ship into port, they threw her boat ropes to the dock, and the people literally grabbed them, pulled them in, pulled the ship physically in, and stormed it. Usually in English history, the storming of a ship is not necessarily a happy moment. This one was. They embraced the old man, welcomed him home, put him in a chair, and carried him body and soul through the streets of Philadelphia. It was the exact physical space that he'd arrived in with a few English coppers and $1 in his pocket in 1723. Now here he is returning triumphant. I have to say, as I put this lecture together, there are no images from the time, but this is a delightful little colonial revival take on Benjamin Franklin, the sedan chair. It has nothing to do with the original documents, but I did get a chuckle out of it as Franklin's returning home here. He, of course, doesn't return home to an empty house. If I were to write a biography of Franklin's relationship with his only daughter, Sarah Franklin Bache, it might well be titled, It's Complicated. Sarah deserves books about her, but she was not that public a person, but she was an incredible individual, every bit as stubborn as her father, every bit as supportive and loving as her late mother, Deborah Reed Rogers Franklin. Sally, as he called her entire life, was a child almost of their old age. Frankie, her older brother, had been born and died, but he died at the age of 4. And she was almost a decade later baby. Not spoiled. He made a very ardent point all the time of not sending her the finery other girls in town were getting. And during the Revolution, I think most importantly, she becomes an ardent patriot. While she may have longed for travel and finery and nice furniture, she becomes an ardent patriot who turns the women of Philadelphia towards a project of making shirts for George Washington's army. And something I didn't know until a wonderful scholar published a diary of another woman during this period is Sally remembered that as the British invaded, sorry, Caitlin and Eleanor, I don't mean to bring up bad tidings, but as the British invaded Philadelphia after the Battle of Brandywine in the fall of 1777, Sally, who had just given birth, got on and rode at a gallop out of town on horseback. This was a tough woman. She had married a man who her father did not approve, Richard Bache. Franklin thought his daughter was worthy of a governor or a minister. She had married a fellow who was a prosperous local merchant, sold wine. He was very supportive, obviously very loving to her. They filled the Franklin house with a load of grandchildren, took care of Deborah in her last years while Benjamin was off trying to wage diplomacy in the court of St. James. And this was the family that greeted him upon his return. I hope this will work. Sally had established herself as the matron of this household and was very much in charge of it. And Franklin really moved into her house, although I'm not sure that he necessarily saw it that way. Again, I go on this in some detail. This is the last portrait we have of Franklin, painted during this period. And I think it's a wonderful way, as we move on in this story, to think about him. The neighbor, the one-time Londoner, Charles Wilson Peel, painted Dr. Franklin in a painting that wasn't quite done at the time that Franklin died. And I think it's just such a tremendous piece of art. As others are being told, be formal, be surrounded by neoclassical grandeur. Here you have the old philosopher wearing a banyan. I don't have one, I've always wanted one. Wearing his coat, wearing loose linen tied at his throat. His head bare, a fashion he's now setting for Americans. And remarkably, his spectacles on. Franklin, I don't know that he created a fashion for wearing your spectacles in a formal portrait, but he certainly did it several times in the last years of his life. Probably, I empathize with him. He didn't have great eyesight. He did make progress. George Goodwin and I will do a debate sometime on the nature of Franklin's contribution to bifocals, and then we can discuss how much we both hate wearing them. But what I really love about this is I don't know how many portraits of founding fathers we have of them working. You don't have one of John Adams practicing law or Thomas Jefferson arranging crops, maybe George Washington waging war. But Franklin is here in the aspect of a natural philosopher. Lightning is striking nearby, and what the natural philosopher does is observe, record, correspond. It had made him famous throughout the British Atlantic world. And in the last portrait that he formally sat for, this is what he's about. We don't know, as I think George Goodwin mentioned in last week's lecture, we don't know what the house looked like. There's been a lot of confusion about that, and I always commend people to go and work with Carrie Dethorne and the amazing staff at Independence National Historical Park, where there is a tremendous library and archive. But when the national park was founded in 1948 and in the decade and more that followed, there was never an image found. People didn't really paint pictures of their houses. This is a hypothesis of what the house looked like. Facing south, a lovely Georgian structure. The first three bays on the left side of your image were the original house that Benjamin and Deborah Franklin had discussed so much in their letters. You can read those online at franklinpapers.org. And then, of course, Franklin never really came into any situation in which he didn't go looking for a way to make it a little better. He loved improvement. And he realized with a personal library of 4,000 books, a lot of grandchildren, Sally and Richard's loving family grew by leaps and bounds. There simply wasn't that much room for Grandpa, so Franklin built it. He wrote to friends that it might be foolish to be building at that point in his life, but he added the wing on the right side of your slide, or on the east side of the building, and there he added a formal dining room where the American Philosophical Society would meet. There he greeted other founding fathers who would gather in Philadelphia in 1787. And there on the second floor, he would sort of have his, I hate the phrase man cave, but his thousands of books, his electrical equipment, art and objects. And much of this is still preserved in various Philadelphia institutions. And you can now visit, if you could somehow go to this building and turn to your left, there's the door of the Benjamin Franklin Underground Museum. The National Park Service made the decision to create a museum rather than build a fake copy of this house. We could do a quick show of hands. Does anyone know where the only one of Franklin's surviving residences is? Caitlin, are you raising your hand? I'm just making sure, but just have to keep you all awake. And I love the domesticity of the story here. Franklin writes that he's keeping busy. He realizes that the market, which runs down the middle of High Street, or was later eventually formally changed to Market Street, which would be at the back of this image, is the best garden to have in the world. So he takes out the front yard and he plants flowering trees. There's record of a beautiful mulberry, plants, gravel walks, and other things to make a nice little Anglo-American gentleman's house here in the middle of noisy, smoky Philadelphia. He writes, and I had to bring her up, and I'm going to have to apologize because I'm going to have to dig around a bit looking for it. But he writes a wonderful letter to his surrogate daughter, Polly Stevenson Hewson. He had met Mary as a young girl when he got to London. She was only a teenager. She'd been enamored by him. And again, if we were to talk about complicated relationships, this second family would certainly qualify for that. And in the book, I'm going into this with much more detail. I know some English historians like to go looking for naughty stories. We've all seen your exported Monty Python episodes, and we know you are a raucous people. That and Dame Judi Dench, but we'd all love her too. People have asked me many times if I think that there was something going on with either of the Stevenson women, and I say, not in everything we know. If you're going to keep a mistress, keeping one under the same roof as her teenage daughter and leaving no record of it is pretty unusual. He became incredibly close with Mrs. Stevenson. And their letters, which I go into in great detail in this forthcoming book project, their letters are really beautiful and in some ways really tragic. If the revolution hadn't broken out, Franklin, a widower by 1775, might have looked at their relationship differently. We don't know. They were, of course, separated when he essentially was forced to leave England. He had the dog sniffing at his heels as he got on that ship. And then, of course, according to English law, he probably would have been considered guilty of treason had they been able to catch him. And I'm sure there were more than one person in Whitehall who would have liked to see him hanged, but that didn't happen. They continued a wonderful correspondence, and Mrs. Stevenson considered going to Paris just to be the manager of his household, is what he called her, whether or not she had any prospects or hopes otherwise. And then, of course, she died. In the letter where Franklin writes to his surrogate daughter about the woman he called his dearest friend. Maybe now we could consider him twice widowed in about a decade. But Polly, the daughter, had a very happy 4-year marriage. We have some physical remnants of that at Franklin House, London, with Dr. Hewson's medical experiments going on there. And Polly spent a great deal of the next few years just waiting on an inheritance that took a long, legal, complicated time to come about. And eventually, she would listen to her great philosopher, her scientist friend, and move to Philadelphia. In one of the best letters we have describing life at Franklin Court, he tells her what it's like. The fine garden, the thriving market, the house full of people. He said, we don't have the type of activities you can have in London. And of course, as a woman who had not inherited a lot, and who was a widow without a lot of money, she couldn't have enjoyed all of London's great things to do. But he says, with the exception of a playhouse with first-rate actors, we can do everything in Philadelphia that you can do there. Why, there's even little musicales to attend. And of course, famously, she would follow him and bring her 3 young children to Philadelphia and create this blended family. I do often ponder what she and Sally must have made of one another. These 2 women, both mothers on their own, both mature women, both having been told for decades that they were part of the same family and never having met, that they were now sort of thrust together with these 2 daughters for whom he had great affection, now finally together. I was reading Ed Lengel's new book yesterday on Franklin and Washington. And he notes the arrival of this building. Franklin got home, realized the old houses lining High Street that he had been buying or inheriting from Deborah's family were just in a wreck. And a lot of buildings suffered greatly during the American War for Independence. There was no paint. You couldn't replace stolen or damaged items. So Franklin had them all tugged down and erected this structure, which would be the public face of the family for the last years of his life, and then many years after, and now beautifully restored by the National Park Service. And for those of you watching in London and other places, I wish I could walk you into the broad archway here that was restored by the National Park Service. It was intact, and I have wonderful memories of the late Penelope Hartshorne Batchelor telling me about the day they figured out that these were the original 1780s buildings. Really wonderful early American buildings that had been greatly changed, but now restored back beautifully by the National Park Service. It's from this world, this world of science and building and family and intellectual engagement and all kinds of other connections, that Franklin begins to note the problems facing America. Can a nation that's really just 13 states, 13 entities, with very little connective tissue between them, survive? Are they going to return to being a British colony, or could they become too much wrapped up in France? And of course, by 1786, Franklin and other political leaders are dealing with issues like uprisings in New England, like others. Franklin returned to a Philadelphia that was no longer the nation's capital. And I go into this in very great detail in my first book, which is called Independence, because they couldn't pay Washington's army. And so the army surrounded Independence Hall and literally took their mark, pointing their guns at the windows where the state government was meeting upstairs and the national government was meeting downstairs. And finally, in the late afternoon, everyone just walked out of the building trying not to get bumped into by a guy with a gun outside. And the federal government had never come back to Philadelphia. That's it, the national government. It's the wrong word to use. It's not a federal government yet. Things are weakened, not strong. The government has no way of raising taxation. And Franklin, who is now the president of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is largely a formal title without a lot of power, but of course we're dealing with 13 states, 13 mini nations. Franklin is becoming increasingly one of the great nationalists of the country. Franklin's role at the Constitutional Convention has been underplayed, I argue. And I know we have a wonderful National Constitution Center here and others, but one of the books that I had to read as a student at Manchester College was Charles Beard's An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, which is one of the most famous books on the American Constitution, published first in 1913. And Beard went on to do a biography of each of the signers of the Constitution, or non-signers. And Franklin gets the tiny paragraph that says, Franklin was so old, he didn't really count very much. That's not true. Franklin worried that he shouldn't get involved in the thing because he might not live to see the end. He was now 81 years old, but he also saw that in order to secure America's future, a stronger national system of government had to come about. This, another of Charles Wilson Peele's wonderful images, this one from the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, shows him during this period of time. And what was this going to mean and how was this going to work out? Franklin once again returned to the old Pennsylvania State House, a building that wasn't built yet when he arrived in 1723 and that he had gotten to watch rise on the outskirts of Philadelphia, way out at 5th Street, now 5th and Chestnut. A place that had been put there so ruffians surrounding the old city house at the intersection of 2nd and Market, just a block from where Franklin and Deborah lived, wouldn't rough up Quaker legislators. So in the summer of 1787, Franklin goes to work on one last grand public endeavor. He is elected by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to be a delegate among the men gathering in the Pennsylvania State House. Some argue that he should be the presiding officer. He has no desire at all to do so. A variety of health problems by this time made long-standing and long public speaking very, very difficult. I didn't have the lung power anymore, but he was never a talker. He didn't like giving speeches. He liked to write. So he once again returns to the Pennsylvania State House and will have one of the most critical roles of his life, now by far the oldest delegate to the convention. The delegate's presiding officer, General George Washington, is the same age as Franklin's son, William, just slightly younger. Other delegates are young enough almost to be his grandson. But he is also one of the two most famous men in the building. And this is a Howard Chandler Christie early 20th century rendition. You will see Franklin smack dab dead center with Alexander Hamilton whispering in his ear. James Madison is off to Franklin's left shoulder, who's almost hidden in the shadows, but of course he was the one who wrote everything down. And George Washington appears to be posing for a statue, which in those heady days of the early 20th century, he seemed to always be doing. I don't think the room looked like this. We know the paneling was wrong. This was 19th century paneling tucked in to make it look fancier when it became a historical shrine. Fortunately, the National Park Service has restored the room back to what it actually looked like. But for these months, from May to September 1787, Benjamin Franklin, who never missed a day, of course, he had to only travel a few blocks. Legend has it that he was carried in a sedan chair. We don't know where he got his sedan chair, although they were the height of fashion in tourist England at this time. You could be carried up to your 3rd floor suite in Bath after having bathed there, but I don't know that Franklin bathed in Bath. But sometimes being carried back and forth, sometimes, very often walking. He liked to say, often sung a popular nursery rhyme about let me become a wise old man, but let me avoid the gout and the stone. Sadly, by this point, he was suffering from both. But Franklin was a critical player in these months of debate and discussion. Here, another view of the State House. Its tower had fallen off or had to be removed after the War for Independence. It couldn't be painted. The wood gave way, and what we have now is a recreation of the original, almost a recreation. I love the personal stories of this summer of 1787. And this is not a great photograph, but with everything locked down right now, this is what I could muster up. When I was the site director of the Powell House in the 1990s, I received a crate in the mail, and as two volunteers and I carefully unpacked it, it was a gift from a descendant of Samuel Powell's nephew, who had inherited these. And it was three silhouettes cut by Samuel Powell, the patriot mayor of Philadelphia, as myth likes to call him. Well, there was one of George Washington, his kinsman, Colonel John Washington, and this. I love the fact that the Powells at the center of the arts and the center of politics, and Mrs. Powell was the grande salonière of Philadelphia during the American Revolution and the period thereafter. I love that Mr. Powell, who had studied art and architecture as a grand tourist, had taken to cutting silhouettes. I hypothesized that the Franklin and Washington group had come for tea, then they had been sitting in the parlor that faces west in the Powell House, and almost certainly used the sunlight where Mayor Powell traced Franklin's head. I love that Mrs. Powell wrote descriptions on the back of each of these. She writes on the back of this Dr. Franklin and on the back of George Washington's General Washington, but not a good likeness. Eliza Powell was a blunt woman, but we'll get more to her. The convention dragged on, and as Franklin pointed out in one of his motions, in which he called for prayer because no one was giving up anything at the start, he said, we have to each be willing to give up something. He was nervous. Of course, one founding father said of the Constitutional Convention, I smell a rat, and others did too. We have debated, historians and curators alike, of whether the story of nailing the windows of Independence Hall shut that summer are true. We have several accounts that the attempt at secrecy was not appreciated by the people of Philadelphia and necessarily of the nation. One account said that that two delegates would sit on Franklin's right and left at every public gathering because they were afraid some attractive young woman would whisper in his ear asking for details about what was going on. He was a widower. He was a fellow with money. He did enjoy the company of the ladies. And again, this is something we could do. I do a week lecture on this when I teach my Franklin course, and we'll do again in Penn this coming spring. But Franklin, the nationalist, you can sort of see them summed up in the 16 proposals that he threw here. I'm just going to go to a few of them. He wanted a very narrow definition of treason. He didn't just want anybody who said anything. I mean, my goodness, I imagine most of our Twitter posts could be called treason in some countries, but I don't think current people in the office read my Twitter posts. He wanted a very loose naturalization process. And in one of the documents he wrote on this topic, he said, in America, we don't ask who you are, we ask what you can do. And if you show that you have talent and use to society, we want you here. And why should we not allow you to become citizens and vote? What would have happened to us during the American War for Independence without our German and Polish and, of course, our French friends? He really didn't want extra money being paid to top officials. In America right now, we have a lot of discussion about certain politicians who are making certain amounts of money that make certain of us shake our heads in disbelief. He wanted judges' salaries to be changed. He wanted the president to be limited to one term. That, of course, didn't happen. That's an error in my slide here. But let's jump ahead. 6 of his proposals were defeated. I do not go on in today's lecture in great detail. I will far more in the book about his grandson, William Temple Franklin. William Temple Franklin had proved himself to be kind of a, how do I translate this into British? I can't say that word because some Americans won't understand what the W would mean. He could be a bit of a piece of work. He very much liked being a courtier. He was the natural son of Benjamin Franklin. Illegitimate, but I don't like that word. But he was very effective in much of what he did at the embassy in Paris. And the person who was in charge of the convention notes made a total mess of them. If James Madison hadn't kept his papers and if Dolly hadn't needed money and sold them to the government, we'd actually know very little about what had happened that summer. He wanted a unicameral legislature. He never trusted upper houses. He wanted a plural executive. It had worked elsewhere, but America, following Europe, was looking for a strong chief executive. Senators never forgave him for wanting them to work without pay. He wanted a council of state. Now, of course, we have a State Department and a whole massive bureaucracy they weren't ready for. And of course, ever the natural philosopher who believed in public improvements, the guy who had capped stinky creeks and sewers and fixed street lighting and invented the lightning rod, wanted the Constitution to talk about cutting canals as a decade or so before it seemed practical. He saw its practicality. That all got lost. And of course, some of his proposals, they just nodded at the old man and no step into the executive. He wanted a second convention. That would have taken a great deal of time. He wanted a committee report on the economy. That wouldn't happen until his close friend, George Washington, of course, appointed his close friend, Alexander Hamilton, and those 4 reports are coming. And interestingly enough, he wanted prayer. Someone asked me recently if Franklin was religious and asking if he would have been into oppressing other religions. And I think certainly not. But he was a guy who had to tap dance in his own town. He was sort of a lapsed Presbyterian in a city that was dominated by the Society of Friends or Quakers. His wife was a member of the Church of England, or what we now call an Episcopalian in America, although I address my pastor when I'm in Virginia as vicar. She giggles at that. But he always saw the efficacy of prayer. He believed in raising money for religious institutions. He believed in religious diversity. And maybe he was looking for a way to get these fellows to calm down and talk. I don't know, but they didn't act on it. They didn't pay. Well, there was no budget, so there was no way to tip the vicar for coming in and leading prayers every morning. I'll say ever so briefly, because I know I'm running long here, and we may. I don't want to break Zoom, but his view of the executive was strongly based on years of fighting with William Penn's challenging son, Thomas, the fellow who had inherited the proprietorship and didn't see any point in paying taxes to support the colony of Pennsylvania. In fact, I don't know if any of you can see me, you're looking at the PowerPoint slide, but I'm wielding the copy that I always worked from of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, edited by my late friend, J.A. Leo LeMay. And because I've been doing Franklin for 30 years almost, but I could not remember where the break in the autobiography was when he started the last section. And it's written in 4 parts, the last of which is written during the period I'm studying in this book. But Franklin literally picks his pen up and goes back to it, writes himself into the corner of getting himself to London in 1757 and trying to push for what he was trying to do, and realizing he couldn't write his way out of this, and he simply never finished the document. What we would do for an account of his daily life on Craven Street now, what we would do for his daily observations on life in London as the British Empire broke itself into pieces over the issue of taxation, representation, and other stuff. What we would do to know what it felt like to sit in the chamber where the Declaration was being written, or the Constitution, or what it felt like to be a Democrat in monarchical Paris, or to have his account. He barely mentions his wife in the autobiography. He never mentions his only daughter. But he never finished it. He wrote himself into corners, and he just left us a pile of paper that we're still trying to figure out more than 2 centuries after it was first published. I'm going to jump over that. I don't know why that was in there. Actually, there's a misplaced slide. A lot of the delegates could tell that Franklin was not terribly happy with the document they'd come up with. There was talk that he would walk out, and several men did, as I hope you all know. Several of the delegates who'd been selected to attend the Constitutional Convention walked out. Most famously, George Mason, because there was no Bill of Rights. The Constitution is written as sort of an operating guide for how to work Zoom, which I can't work Zoom very well. Thank God Caitlin's on here today. And faithfully, Franklin asked to have the last speech before the convention in September 1787. And you could almost hear the fellows who were on the fence go, ooh, what's he going to say? And he was not a fellow who liked to give long speeches. And I don't have time to even read long paragraphs in today's lecture. But now, in a great deal of pain, gout hurts, and gallstones or bladder stone hurts. Standing would be difficult. And he again had some lung issues, so long speeches were impossible. So he asked the young Scots-born law teacher and lawyer, James Wilson, who literally was the Pennsylvania delegate who wrote most of the Constitution. We didn't know this for a long time. James Wilson's papers have been discovered in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, closed now, but once COVID is done, we'll all be back in there, back to our tables. And he asked James Wilson to read this thing. Wilson was, quite frankly, one of the people who had literally seen the problems of the revolution, perhaps going, in his view, too far, when his own house, just a few blocks from the Pennsylvania State House, had been swarmed by people who didn't like the clients he was taking after the British occupation of Philadelphia ended in 1778. Franklin said that I confess there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve, but I am not sure that I shall never approve them. For having lived long, he's now 81 years old, I've experienced many instances of being obliged to better information or fuller consideration to change opinions, even on important subjects, which I once thought right, but found to be otherwise. How many politicians say, oops, I changed my mind, I was wrong, you were right? It is therefore that the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgment of others. In these sentiments, sir, I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if they are such, because I think a general government necessary for us, and there is no form of government but what may be a blessing to the people if well administered. And I believe further that it is likely to be well administered for the course of years and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. I doubt too whether any convention we can obtain may be able to make a better constitution. For when you assemble the number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me, sir, addressing George Washington, to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. And I think it will astonish our enemies who are waiting with confidence to hear that our councils are confounded like those of the builders of Babel, and that our states are on the point of separation, only to meet hereafter for the purpose of cutting one another's throats. Thus, I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. On the whole, sir, I cannot help but expressing a wish that every member of the convention who may still have objections to it would with me on this occasion doubt a little of their own infallibility and make manifest our unanimity. Put his name on this instrument. As the delegates rose to sign the final thing, Franklin, ever the art critic among other things, noted that he had spent the months sitting there, realizing that Pennsylvania had bought some new furniture. Independence National Park's wonderful curatorial staff has done intensive research and discovered, again, Eleanor, I'm not holding you personally responsible, but when the British used the building for awful purposes during the occupation, they'd used most of Pennsylvania's state office furniture for kindling. And Pennsylvania, feeling a little flush afterwards, had designed this beautiful chair by a local craftsman. It still sits in our Independence Hall. Some argue there are a bunch of causes behind it, and I think we'll get another person to talk about the chair in more detail another morning, evening, wherever in the world you are right now. But if you look at the very top, the top rail, the symbol right above George Washington's head at the very top is a liberty cap, the ancient Roman and then adopted by the French and the American symbol for the power of people, of liberty that exists outside of any written document. But above it was a sun. And Franklin said to the delegates surrounding him that he'd been wondering if that sun peeping over the horizon, looking back at him for 4 months, what direction was he looking? Was it a setting sun? Was this the end of something? Or was it a rising sun? And he said, looking at this Constitution, I have the sense that we are now a rising sun. As one of his friends would put him in this decade, we're a rising people. And still we rise, I hope. Franklin put his name. Can you see if I play with my, this? Here's Pennsylvania down here. And there's his big, lovely signature among them, which I can't see with my bad eyesight, but sorry, B. Franklin. Right there, I don't know if you're seeing my arrow or not. Franklin, it is said, led the delegates out of Independence Hall on that day, September 17th, 1787, and was encountered there, and a story that is still bantered about. I don't know how much our international visitors understand, how our international participants, I should say, understand the American constitutional system, but our Speaker of the House, a Californian named Nancy Pelosi, quoted this moment when we found it necessary to try a member of our executive branch recently for poor behavior. She didn't cite, but she quoted this woman who was Elizabeth Willing Powell, who was the daughter of one of Philadelphia's wealthiest merchant families, had been orphaned young when her father caught a shipboard disease, married the wealthy former Quaker Samuel Powell, established a house at 3rd Street that still stands today. Please come visit. I'll give you a tour and a glass of Madeira afterwards. Elizabeth Powell was perhaps the greatest political thinker in town who was barred entry into that building. She was a keen, savvy politician, a salonière, she would have been called among Franklin's friends in France. But she was, as a woman, she was not permitted in the halls of government. And so she used her tea table, her salon, her dining room, and always had her finger on the pulse of what was going on in town. The story, and if you can find it, Zara Annis Hanslin, the American who wrote the wonderful book, Portrait of a Woman in Silk, wrote a wonderful op-ed piece for the Washington Post some months back, but you can Google search that. Annis Hanslin is spelled just like it sounds. Talking about the Mrs. Powell said afterwards, I never asked the question, but I don't believe that, and I hope none of you too. The question Elizabeth Powell said, standing in front of a crowd, a gathering, maybe one could say a mob outside Independence Hall. You know, mobs are quickly formed out of large gatherings, as we're seeing in America of late. She looked at him square in the eye, a man she had known since her birth in 1743. She said, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us? Is it a republic or a monarchy? And he looked at her and said, Madam, you have a republic if you can keep it. He was a very strong believer in the virtue and needs of the people. Elizabeth, in later life, here's a much later portrait of her, in what Rosie Zagare has described as the revolutionary backlash against women who were politically active in the 19th century. Mrs. Powell denied this had taken place, but we have wonderful primary sources that say it certainly did, and I think it's a good sentiment to live on forever. And then, I don't know if Walter Stabe is on this today, and then of course they all retreated to Smith's, or what we now call the City Tavern, here on the left side of the building, and they drank a great deal of rum punch and Madeira and porter and a lot of beer. If you can look this up, when I lecture longer on the Constitution, I have the liquor bill for that evening and their breakage bill for the amount of bottles and glasses they went through. The delegates blew off some steam and then went home to get the Constitution ratified. I'm going to have to jump a little bit. With the Constitution ratified in 1788, and I'm having to cut a lot for time, but maybe they'll let me give part deux of this when I'm in London. Hopefully the border will be open again soon. When the constitutional government began being formed, a lot of people began flooding to Philadelphia on their way to the nation's capital, which was then New York. And I guess I'll leave you with this story. Thomas Jefferson had returned from France, planning to go back to Monticello to try and get his farms back in order. When he arrived there, there was a letter waiting from President George Washington, who had been sworn in April. And Jefferson was invited to come and form the American Foreign Ministry, for those of you in England, or the State Department, as what we hope we still have. The State Department's not having a particularly good week, but you can read the Post after this and see what's going on there. Jefferson came to Philadelphia, in part because he was on his way to forming a new federal government, but in part he wanted to give a last visit to Benjamin Franklin. Everyone in the country knew that Franklin was dying, and Franklin had taken to bed by this point. And there is a wonderful account in Thomas Jefferson's Autobiography, which I have right here, but we're running late, so you can grab your Library of America, or the Jefferson papers are available online. This account of going to Franklin Court, being greeted by Franklin's daughter, a house full of grandchildren. We know from some of Franklin's own papers that the grandchildren were a little too rambunctious because their entire pots of ink dumped across Franklin's original papers by these grandkids. And that when he arrived, Franklin was in bed, propped up, helping his lungs, which were in trouble at this point, while his grandchildren were seated around the bed doing their math lessons and giving them to him to mark. This wonderful little scene of domesticity was interrupted by the first Secretary of State of the United States of America coming in, Franklin becoming very agitated because he wanted to know everything that was going on in Paris. The year before, the Bastille had fallen. In the months that followed, some of Franklin's old friends would face the guillotine. And when Franklin became increasingly agitated, and Jefferson, who had lost his father young and didn't really know elderly people that well, Jefferson, I read it as he became very nervous and agitated. And when Franklin finally got done pummeling with questions, the old sage fell back into his bed pillows and breathed deeply. And wanting to change the subject, Jefferson said, "I understand you're writing a memoir." And Franklin said, "Oh, it's too late. I waited too long to finish it." He said, "No, you must." And Franklin called one of the grandkids over and to go into a locked cabinet, and he handed him sheets of papers, and he handed him the only draft he had of part of the autobiography. And I've always said, if I could be in one moment in history, one time, if I could enter another era, I'd like to see these two people of the Enlightenment at that bedside, passing this critical document. The only reason we have this, I'm thumping Leo LeMay's edition of Franklin's papers, is because Jefferson kept it and returned it to the family. These two fellows, these are two fantastic Udon busts. If you have an original and you'd like to give it away, I can send you my address. I have my copy behind my shoulder here. These two fantastic individuals. Of course, and I have gone on too long, but I'll say Franklin still had issues to think about. During this same time, he was written to by the president of Yale College, Ezra Stiles, and Stiles had asked him for a picture of Franklin to go in the library at Yale, and then he said, no one ever talks about your views on religion. What are they? And Franklin, you can almost see him smiling as he takes pen to paper, and he says, well, I believe in the efficacy of prayer, and I believe in good works, and I believe in all of these things. And as for Jesus of Nazareth, whether he was divine or not, I don't intend to really spend my last hours worrying about this, because I have full belief that I'll have access to the primary source very, very soon. I'm going to jump ahead and say, Franklin passed in the early morning hours of April the 17th, 1790. His daughter and his surrogate daughter had gone to bed. His two grandsons, William Temple, the courtier, and Benjamin Franklin Bache, who didn't really want a formal education and loved printing, and who in the next decade, until his own death in 1798, would be one of America's greatest rabble-rousing printers, were at his side. His funeral, a few days later, would be the first time the United States of America had to publicly mourn anyone so famous. And the world went into mourning in its ways. But that's a story I told last summer at Franklin House, and you can read in the epilogue of this book that I now need to sit down and type, Old Man in a Young Country. Caitlin, are you still there? Have you fallen asleep?
No, I am here. Thank you so much, George, for that fascinating talk, and we look forward to reading the book when it eventually does come out. So we have time for some questions. So for those of you who have not used Zoom Webinar before, there's two ways that you can do that. You can either raise your hand and I will call on you, or you can type a question in the Q&A section. And actually, it looks like we have a couple questions already in the Q&A section, so I'll just read those out for you.
Can you read me names too, and I'll wave if they're friends I know, and if they're really mean to me, I won't send you a Christmas card this year.
So the first one's actually from George Goodwin.
George Goodwin, I've heard of him.
Yes. What do you think was Franklin's greatest achievement? And what do you think he felt was his greatest single achievement?
Available now on Amazon, Benjamin Franklin in London, the masterwork of the great George Goodwin. You appreciate that, old boy? Oh, wow, greatest achievement, that's a toughie. That's a real toughie. I mean, he lived for 84 years. He didn't get shot by a jealous husband. Okay, that's a terrible thing to say. I would have to say manipulating independence and securing it. I mean, I have never gone into great detail in my own writing about his career in Paris, but the fact that he was able to convince Louis XVI to support American independence was tremendous. For my own personal beliefs, I have written a lot on Franklin's educational writings, and I think what he did to democratize American education with the creation of the Academy and then the College of Philadelphia is incredibly important. America is what America is because, and maybe one of America's great legacies to the world has been the idea that you deserve an education, and it's not just something for the rich. There are those, even today, there are those politicians who would like to deny poorer people free access to education. They are greatly un-American in my judgment. So I think Franklin's 1749 educational proposals and others, and the way that he worked to educate everybody was very important. Wasn't great at education in his own daughter, but they were stubborn and banged heads a lot.
Great. So the next question next question we have is from Anne Bagamary, who asks, how good was Franklin's command of French?
That's a really good question. And my own command of French is, well, as I mentioned, my dear mentor, David Was, who took me to study in Senegal in 1987, and I'm told I still speak French with a very thick West African accent, which the people of Paris have always found quite amusing. My own command of French probably isn't good enough to really critique it, but to say that he did get by in French, and he did flirt in French. And so, you know, if you're an 80-year-old fellow who's getting interest in the ladies by the witticisms you're able to drop in two languages, that's pretty good. He certainly never tried to, to write grand philosophical treatises, but he did go head to head in conversations with Voltaire and a whole bunch of other people. So, I think it was pretty good. Now, modern spelling rules aren't invented until a lot later, and so I've never gone into that. That would be something really good. We should get the Franklin Papers team who've worked on his French papers. I don't know if Kate Ono or anybody's on here, but you could wave a hand, or I don't know how to work this thing, so.
Well,
Good question.
it's interesting to think that there's still aspects of Franklin's life that we still haven't even really touched on. So,
Yeah.
there's so much to learn and explore.
Every time I'll share the story that the last thing I did the weeks before I got tenure when I was at Penn State were to go look at a document just to say, well, and found the missing member of Franklin's Junto Club, which I'm told I'm on Wikipedia for. You have to be famous for something. But it's, there's mountains, once the archives open, I'm very desirous to get back to England to write the English part of this book. So we need to cure COVID.
We would welcome you at Benjamin Franklin House. So.
Marcia has told me I can't sleep there, but
So the next question that we have is from Rob Cattell, who asks Ben's later
hi,
views
Rob.
on slavery. He's asking what Ben's later views were on slavery.
Rob Cattell is a wonderful resident of Elfress Alley in Philadelphia, a street Benjamin Franklin knew well, and he and his wife are stalwarts of the old city community. Rob, I cut this for time. An entire chapter of the book deals with Franklin, who, to say it's complicated is a gross understatement. But Franklin, by this period in his life, was an adamant abolitionist, and but also living in a world where slavery was everywhere. Enslaved people were a part of every moment of life. He would be a strident abolitionist in his last years in France. His own enslaved people simply vanished from the record unless the staff at Franklin House had found something since I looked. But we don't know what happened to them. Likely meaning he just said, you're free to do whatever you want, and they left. And there were no formal abolition papers. If they existed, they probably didn't. But Franklin really believes this has to come to an end. And the last act he does, again, as a man in his early 80s, dying by all accounts, in severe pain, a retiree, the last things he writes are missives on anti-slavery. And I've given whole lectures and such on that, and you notice I think I jumped over the Wedgwood medallion. Wedgwood, the wonderful ceramicists in England, had created an image that's about this big, showing an enslaved man kneeling, chains on him, asking, and there's a cartoon around it saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Franklin very much said yes. He did everything he could to eradicate enslavement within his own family, adding provisions to his last will and testament, which the daughter and son-in-law complied with, and did a great deal otherwise. It would be great to either, maybe the ladies of the Franklin House were asking what future programs, and it looks like we're going to get to keep, I have no idea how many people you are on here. There's probably an icon, but I don't know. I only know that Caitlin and David and I are on at the moment. How many people are on this, Caitlin?
So there's 44 people watching.
44. So maybe we should do a Franklin and Slavery symposium internationally in the months ahead. But that's a great question. When I see you next, I'll give you a much longer answer.
Great. Well, the next question is from somebody that you know, Marcia, who asks,
I've met her.
Yes. What would Benjamin Franklin think of politics at the current moment globally and in America?
Marcia, you know I don't like to use language like that. Marcia Balasciano is the founding mother of the restored Benjamin Franklin House in London, where we will all gather again one day. I miss you terribly. I really wish I was taking you and the kids, as I insist on calling you, out to the ship and shovel after this, but we'll all be over again soon. I was told by a judge last fall that I'm a presidential historian, which sometimes is considered a dirty phrase. I don't know, but I've been studying the American presidency since 1977, when I was a wee small boy. And what I see in the newspaper every day right now, to use a term that the staff of the Franklin House, it gobsmacks me. The fact, this latest scandal at the State Department, where the Secretary of State is hosting political dinners with no diplomats involved, and we're paying for it. Well, I'm sorry, you aren't. I'm paying for it. It's our tax money is going to have what they're calling Madison dinners. My God, James Madison would turn in his grave if he knew someone was pulling this. His wife, Dolly, who is, if you don't know much about her, Dolly Madison invented modern Washington and believed in nonpartisanship and was a great admirer of, as a young woman, of Franklin. And this idea is just, it's amazing. Franklin loved science. He really thought science could have a solution. We agreed that I wouldn't talk much about his passing, but I will say, among the wishes the family ignored were, Franklin, upon death, wanted to have his body submerged in a hogshead of Madeira wine. That's about 500 gallons of booze. And he thought maybe he had seen a fly land in a glass of Madeira and nobody was watching, so he took the fly out and threw it on the table, and it sat in the sunshine and it coughed it out and flew away. And he thought maybe he could come back 100 years after death and maybe he'd get to see how, if it had all worked. They didn't do it. He was buried next to his wife over on Arch Street. But I think the idea that we're living in a moment where we're surrounded by heroes right now. My sister, who may be on this, although she's seeing patients today, my sister is a hero in Lansing, Michigan. The doctors who treated my friend John Murren, who passed 2 weeks ago of COVID, the caregivers who are taking care of so many of my friends who are in their 80s and 90s. The idea that the government is refuting science right now, some members of the government are refuting science, Franklin would be, he would beat them with his cane. But that's just my political opinion.
Great. So we only have time for one more question, and I think this is good to end on kind of a more positive note. If you could convey one meaningful message or lesson from Franklin's life to today's people, what would it be? And this is from Shane N.
Hi, Shane N. I don't know who you are, but I do. One lesson. Smart counts. You don't have to be rich to be a person of integrity and power. One lesson, huh? And being of good virtue and decent to the people around you is awfully important. I will say, can I make 2 public service messages if we're running out of time? Number one is, she's shaking her head no, but I'm doing it anyway. Number one is, if you want to be in touch, there was no way we could do this and have a Zoom discussion. But we, as I've been doing with teachers lately on our de facto, we could set one up via Zoom, and maybe the Franklin House folks, we could do it at a time that everybody's awake. Number 2 is, every museum in the world right now is suffering. Gate is important. So Marcia, I think I figured out to send my 100 quid pledge to the Franklin House London. Here, if you have any of these, this is a 20-pound note, you should go join the Franklin House today. If you have a 1,000-pound note, I don't know if you have 1,000-pound notes, but you should send one of those. The Franklin House is an international center for the study of him and the 18th century and the values that he believed in. I think they're still important values, so join today, and we will all gather there next. Peace be with thee.
Thank you very much, George, for saying that. And I will just wrap this up by saying thank you very much for everybody who's tuned in and who's asked questions. Very much appreciated. And as George said, a lot of museums are suffering currently. So we do have a donation link on our page. There is no obligation. We're doing these talks free of charge, but we'd appreciate any small amount to help us keep going to do these public programmings. And the next week, we will be having a talk as part of our Fulbright series, and it'll actually be about what Benjamin Franklin would have thought of Facebook. So it'll be next Thursday at 3 p.m. British Standard Time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you can, please do tune in. Otherwise, we will updating our website in terms of our different programming going forward. So thank you very much again, George, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.